Morning. Always appreciate your thoughts, Alex, on the Lord's Supper. Today I think I got a sermon seed out of it, living in communion. I like that idea. Thank you for those words. If you have ever wanted to learn something new, if you have ever wanted to maybe get into a new hobby or something like that, if you've ever started a class, maybe in college or something like that, there's always this kind of initial introduction class that you typically have to take. It's often called a 101 class, and we're familiar with that. It's an introductory class. It goes over basics, it goes over fundamentals, it goes over the essentials, it goes over things that you must understand first before getting into more deeper areas of whatever subject that it is. It is an introductory class. That's why it is a 101 class, which means it is the first class in the 100 course level classes, which is introductory classes. It's the first one in that set. And if you don't learn things in the 101 class, you are not going to understand some of the basics and fundamentals that you need when you start getting into some of the deeper areas for that subject. And a lot of times you really can't even get to those deeper lessons if you don't first pass the intro class, because you need all of those fundamentals for everything else. But we understand that idea. We see that often out in the world a lot of times. We, find videos and everything about it, but like budgeting 101. We understand that. You might look at a video or something, finance 101, right? Or home ownership 101, time management, relationships, leadership. We understand that idea, and we've seen all kinds of things on that. Probably have even been in some of those classes ourselves. Now, you could also do that, though, with spiritual things. You could also do that same thing with spiritual topics. For instance, maybe you might have a class on prayer, right? Prayer 101. Maybe a popular one would be Bible study. Bible study 101. Kind of learn some basics of how to do some Bible study. We kind of had one of those classes here. Repentance 101, stewardship, fellowship, all the ships, right? You could have a class on a lot of those topics that has to do with some spiritual things, including discipleship. And that's one that we are actually going to talk about today as we discuss something that has to do with Discipleship 101. Discipleship 101. We're going to learn and talk about something that is very foundational when it comes to discipleship to Jesus, and we're going to learn it from the Master, Jesus. All right, and we'll be in Matthew in just a moment. Now, it might surprise you to know the word disciple gets thrown around in Christianity a lot. It might surprise you to know that word actually doesn't even show up until Matthew chapter 5. So 5 chapters in, now we actually see the word disciple in the Gospels. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 1, right there at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount. And Matthew says that he, that be Jesus, went up on the mountain, and after he sat down, his disciples came to him. And that's the first time that it is used. Now, we could talk a lot about what Jesus says there in that entire sermon, Matthew 5, 6, and 7, and talk about all the many things that he discussed in that sermon, and maybe we will, because it does have a lot to do with discipleship. But really, I don't want to talk about that necessarily. I want to go to the first place that Jesus actually used the word disciple. Where does he use it? How does he use it? Where is that? Well, it actually doesn't show up until further into Matthew's gospel. The word disciple doesn't show up actually until chapter 10, until Jesus uses it. Actually halfway into chapter 10 is whenever he first uses it. And if you remember in chapter 10, that's where we have the limited commission, right? It's not the Great Commission, it's the limited commission that Jesus talks about. He's there, he's talking to his apostles, he's talking to the 12, and he's talking to them about, okay, who they are going to start going out and start to preach to now, okay? They weren't going to go to the Gentiles, they weren't going to go to the Samaritans yet, it wasn't their time yet. He says, no, you are to go to the lost sheep of the house of Israel first, okay? That's this limited commission in that sense. That's Matthew chapter 10. Okay, God was going to give the house of Israel the opportunity first to listen to the preaching about how the kingdom of heaven was at hand. And so, as Jesus is kind of discussing that, as he is walking them through how to go about doing all of that, he starts talking about how some people are not going to receive their word. Some people aren't going to accept the preaching that they are going to bring, and that there is going to be some persecution whenever you guys start going to these cities and you guys start preaching. There's going to be some persecution that comes along with that. And when that happens, he says, flee to the next city. Just go, just keep going. And that's the same context where Jesus says, look, if they don't receive you, if they don't receive your words, shake the dust off your feet and move on, right? That's the same context. So he says, flee to the next city. There's going to be persecution. If that happens, flee to the next city. But it's right after that. It's right after that in Matthew chapter 10, and it's actually in verse 24. And that's where Jesus uses the word, and he says this. He says, a disciple is not above his teacher, nor a slave above his master. That right there is the first time Jesus uses it in the gospel. So the first time it's used, we see that it's used really in the context of persecution. Now, I don't exactly want to talk about that side of it, but I do want us to pay attention to what he is saying. Now remember, we're talking about discipleship. Discipleship 101, okay? We're talking about something very entry-level, beginner-level, introductory-level stuff here, material, to this whole thing about discipleship and being better disciples, okay? That's what we're talking about. And here's what the class begins with. If you were in that class, and I was the instructor, I turned around and said, okay, here's the first thing that you need to know. Here's the first thing you need to know. The disciple is not above his teacher. That'd be the first thing that I might put on the board. The disciple is not above his teacher. Now, there's a whole lot to be said in that statement that Jesus says. There's a whole lot right there in that verse. And I think if we're trying to apply that, if we're trying to kind of bring that over into our lives, well, I think it does apply to us as individuals, and I think it could apply in a more broader sense even to like congregations as a whole. Okay? And if we were all in a discipleship 101 class, this is something that everybody would really need to understand and grasp before moving on to some of the more deeper things. That no person who seeks to be a disciple of Jesus can be above Jesus. No congregation who seeks to be a body of disciples can be above Jesus. Everybody would need to understand that. Okay? He actually says the same thing in Luke chapter 6 in verse 40. Now he uses, at least the translation is, a student. It's the same word, but a student is not above his teacher, but everyone after he has been fully trained will be like his teacher. And he goes on, he says the same thing actually in John chapter 13 when he gives them the example of washing one another's feet. And he says in 15 and 16, he says, "For I gave you an example, that you should do as I did to you. Truly, truly, I say to you, a slave is not greater than his master, nor is one who is sent greater than the one who sent him." And then again, he says it in chapter 15 too. So, several times, Jesus has told them, listen, you're not above the teacher. You're not greater than the master. Everybody who seeks to be a disciple of Jesus needs to understand that lesson right there. That discipleship means being under the master. Now, excuse me, with that idea, there are some things to think through as it pertains to the disciple-Jesus relationship. There's some implications that come along with that. We'll talk about two of them this morning. But one of the things that you may notice or catch or think about, one of the implications to this, the disciple not being above his teacher, is, here's one thing we got to understand, an understanding of location. Okay, if you're trying to be a disciple, you have to have this understanding of location. Notice what he says. The disciple is not above his teacher, and the slave isn't above the master. Well, if the disciple or the slave is not above the teacher or the master, where are they then? Well, they are not beside. They are not adjacent to. They are not above. They are not over or higher. They are under. They are below. They are beneath the teacher and the master. Well, if that's where they are, that kind of tells me something. That tells me that in this, there is... Did I miss the slide? I may have missed the slide. Sorry about that. Anyway, but that tells me that there is an element of humility and submission. That was the slide you were supposed to get. There's an element of humility and submission when it comes to being a disciple, okay? Jesus says that the disciple really does need to recognize their status and the humble position that they are in as a disciple. Okay? When you're in the position of being a disciple, that's where you're at. If that's what you want, and if that's what you're after, there's a lot of humility that comes along with that. There's got to be. There's a lot of humility, there's a lot of submission. And Jesus said in Matthew 16:24, listen, if anyone wishes to come after me, what does he have to do? He's got to deny himself. He has to deny himself, he's got to take up his cross, and he has to follow me. He also says it in Luke chapter 14, verse 27, whoever does not carry his own cross and come after me, he cannot be my disciple. Well, that's pretty powerful. So there's an element of humility. There's an attitude of submission when it comes to being a disciple and following Jesus. And sometimes, that gets hard. Sometimes that gets hard. Sometimes that gets very costly. Not monetarily, by the way. Costly with your life. Things that you may have to give up, costly, that kind of cost. Sometimes it's not very popular either to be a disciple. It demands a denial of self. It demands saying no to some of the fleshly desires that I have. I've got to put those things away from me. I've got to put those things down if I want to be a disciple. I've got to carry my own cross. I've got to die on my own cross. I've got to die to the very things that keep me from following Jesus. If I want to be a disciple of Jesus, that's what I've got to do. You learn to submit and you learn to be humble. If you think about what a person does maybe when they are not humble. Maybe when they're not humble. Well, sometimes they have maybe a hard time listening to things, don't they? They've got a hard time listening to instructions. They may think that they don't need all the instructions. They've already got it all figured out. They may think of themselves more highly than they actually are. They may boast about that. They may be prideful. They may kind of do things on their own terms, or they may push back or argue or debate with maybe. They get defensive if they're corrected or critiqued even in the slightest bit. That's what people do when they're not humble. That's what people do whenever they don't have an attitude of submission. But Jesus says, look, that can't be your posture if you want to be a disciple of mine. The disciple is not above the teacher. The disciple listens to the instructions that the teacher gives. It doesn't go in one ear and out the other. He listens to it. He listens in order to obey it too. The disciple understands that they don't know it all and that the teacher does. They don't think of themselves more highly. They don't boast in themselves. They're not prideful. They don't argue with the teacher. They don't debate with the teacher. They don't get defensive if they're corrected. That's what an attitude of humility looks like. That's what an attitude of submission looks like. And that's exactly what Jesus calls people to do as disciples. Why? Well, because disciples need to understand their location. That's why we understand that we're below the teacher, not above. We understand that our preferences take a back seat when it comes to being a disciple of Jesus. I mean, what we want has to be secondary to what Jesus wants. He must increase, we must decrease. And that's true in my own life, and that's true even in a congregation. The disciple puts themselves under the control of Jesus, and they let Him lead. That's what it is. Now, that goes with the second point, and something else that we would need to understand. Here's another implication. Something else you would think about is where the authority is. With what Jesus said there, where the authority is. So the disciple has to understand that since he is not above the teacher, he doesn't have the same level of authority that the teacher has. The slave doesn't have the same level of authority that the master has over the slave. So if anybody is going to seek to be a disciple of Jesus, they're going to have to come to grips with the authority that Jesus has. Some people can do that and some people can't. That gets testy a little bit. Okay? But Jesus did say, and I know we go to it all the time, but I mean, He said it. He said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go make disciples. So Jesus has all the authority. The disciple doesn't have that. The disciples are not the ones that gets to determine how things go. They do not make the rules. The teacher does that. The master does that, not them. They are not in the position to correct the teacher. They are not in the position to rebuke the teacher or reprove or lecture the teacher. They are under the authority of the teacher. Now, this has a bearing on the lives of individuals. It has a bearing on congregations as a whole who seek to be disciples of Christ. It does. When the Bible says that Jesus has all the authority, that means He has the ultimate say-so. And if I as an individual am trying to be someone who follows Jesus, if I'm trying to be someone who implements the teachings of Jesus into my life, I have to realize that there is a higher authority than me who directs the things that I do and how I function. I've got to realize that. If discipleship to Jesus is what I'm after, I don't get to make the rules. Essentially, I don't get to be the authority over my life because He's the authority over my life. I don't wear the crown. He wears the crown. And since He is the authority over my life, I don't get to change something. I don't get to change something that He said. I don't get to kind of pick and choose what I want to follow or what I don't feel like following. I don't get to walk through the teachings of Jesus as if it's some sort of buffet line and only do and follow the things that I like and make me feel good. I don't get to do that. I don't get to do that because as a disciple, I am not the one in charge. He is. He is. But you know, there's a lot of people There's a lot of people out in the world who claim to be disciples of Jesus, people that claim to be disciples of the Master. Yet they try to do things their own way, and they try to take matters into their own hands. You know, and instead of letting Jesus tell them how to treat somebody, well, they may decide how they're going to treat somebody. Instead of Jesus kind of teaching them through his teachings how they might speak to someone, or how they might go about handling something that was done to them, well, they don't really let Jesus rule in those areas. Sometimes they take over. They decide how they're going to handle things. They don't let Jesus tell them. Sometimes, I mean, people do pick and choose what they want to follow, what they want to believe, and what they want to practice. They may take some of the information that the Master said, but they may not take all of it. You know, a lot of people, they love what Jesus has to say about grace. And so do I. I do too. But a lot of people love to hear those things about what Jesus says about grace. They love what Jesus says about loving people, and so do I. A lot of people love to get behind what Jesus said about not judging. They're fine to take in all of those things, but they may not take in some of the more harder things. They may not accept the things that Jesus actually said about what love looks like. They don't accept that there is only one truth. They may not really listen to the rest of what Jesus said about judging. They don't accept what Jesus said about marriage sometimes. They don't accept what Jesus may have said about obedience or hell. Those are some harder topics. Sometimes people don't really listen to those things that Jesus talked about. And congregations and faith groups everywhere are sometimes the same way, in kind of the same sense. I mean, sometimes they try and do things and hold on to traditions that the Master didn't prescribe, and worse, maybe they sometimes take it even further, and they try and force other disciples into holding to or adhering to things that the Master never even spoke about. Or the other side of that, they may try to change it. They may try to change, or they may try to do things differently or teach something other than what the Master did speak about. I don't understand that. But you see, it happens in both worlds. It happens with people in their individual lives. It even happens in congregations of people. But true discipleship in my life says Jesus has the authority, not me. True discipleship in a congregation says Jesus has the authority, not the church. Not necessarily the elders, not the preacher, not the people, not the deacons. He has all of the authority. He is the head of the church. Now, there's some delegation that goes out, obviously. Okay, that's why we do have elders, why we have deacons. Okay, but he's the head of it. He has all the authority. And it's never right. It is never right to go beyond or not follow the authority of Jesus. It's never right to do either one of those things. In what he taught, in what he preached about, with the things that have to do with our lives and how we should live, we should not go beyond that, and we should not disobey that. Shouldn't disobey his authority in either situation, whether it's your life or even in a whole congregation of people. To be a disciple, rule number one really is that we've just got to recognize where the authority is and who has it, and realize that we don't. Why? Because as disciples, we are not above the teacher. We do not have the authority that the teacher has. That's why. Now, we didn't read it at the start, But I want us to notice what Jesus says in verse 25 as we kind of close it out here. Look what he says in verse 25. After he says the bit about the disciple not being above the teacher, the slave is above his master, it is enough for the disciple that he become like his teacher and the slave like his master. If they have called the head of the house Beelzebul, how much more the members of his household? Now remember, this is right in the middle of that persecution. He had said in 23, you are going to get persecuted. If you go to the cities, know that's coming. Flee to the next one. But he says, look, in that same context of persecution, he says, if they called me the head of the house Beelzebul, basically, what do you think they're going to say to you? So understand that's coming. But then look what he says, though. He says, it is enough. What is he saying? Well, he's saying that look, this is all that I want. This is all that I am asking you to do. I just want you to be like me. That's what I'm asking for everybody, for the apostles, the 12, for anybody who wants to be a disciple. Jesus just wants us to be like him. And listen, discipleship isn't about how much you know about Jesus. Discipleship is about how much you live and look like Jesus. That's discipleship. It's not about how much you know. You can know all about the Master. That doesn't matter. It doesn't matter unless it's affecting you and how you live and how you operate. That's what matters. That's discipleship. That's what matters. And all he wants us to do is try and live like him in everything that we do. In everything that we do. And that is enough. That's what he said. Listen, if you're a Christian, before you grab your songbooks and everything, listen, if you're a Christian, remember that the disciple isn't above the teacher, and he has all of the authority. And as you live your life, live it in a way that looks like Jesus in everything. In everything that you do. How you treat people, make it look like Jesus. How you serve, make it look like Jesus. How you talk to people, make it look like Jesus. Everything that you do, you make it look like Jesus. That's how you live. That's discipleship. Now, if you are not a Christian, okay, there's a difference. If you're not a Christian and you've listened to this, remember that this is 101 class, okay? It's not meant to be advanced. It's not meant to be hard. It's not meant to be complicated. It's entry-level stuff. But if you want to be a disciple of his, you have to know that this is what you would be getting into. This stuff right here about discipleship, this is the stuff that you'd be getting into, okay? You're getting into a life where he is over you. You're getting into a life where he has the ultimate authority over you. You're getting into a life of humility, and you're getting into a life of submission. And yeah, it's not easy. It's not easy. It's a higher calling. It's a disciplined way to live. Remember I said discipleship next to discipleship, right? It's a more disciplined way to live. It's a higher standard of living. And some people can handle that and some people can't. And that's the real hard truth of it. But you have to understand what you're getting into. This is the life. But listen, there ain't nobody better to put yourself under. There's nobody better to put yourself under. Okay? He died for you, and he loves you, and he wants a relationship with you. He offers salvation, and he offers forgiveness, and he offers eternal life. Who better to put yourself under than somebody that offers you that? It's kind of a no-brainer to me. That's what he offers. And if you want that, you can have that. Listen, if you're not a Christian, the ball's in your court. The ball's in your court. He's not going to force you. He's not going to force anything on you. This is your decision. Listen, if you need to respond to any of that in any way, you can do that now. We can help you. The church can help you as we stand and sing.